Good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle Witcher, Program Manager of Arts and Letters Live here at the Dallas Museum of Art. I'm delighted to welcome all of you this evening to our event featuring Celeste Ng. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones. We will do a Q&A session after Celeste has her conversation on stage with Lois Kim. So if you have a question that you would like to ask her, please raise your hand so that one of us can bring you a wireless microphone. If you are able to stand when you pose your question, it makes it much easier for her to find you in the audience. I hope that you will make plans to join us at the book signing after the event. It will be in the concourse near the museum store where copies of her books are available for purchase. As many of you already know, this is a great book to give to friends, so pick up a copy for yourself and a couple of extra for your gift closet. Arts and Letters Live is supported by our annual series supporters, the K. Catarula Endowment for the Literary and Performing Arts, and the McGee Foundation Arts and Letters Live Endowment Fund at the Dallas Museum of Art. Additional major support is provided by the Hirsch Foundation. The Fairmont Hotel Dallas is the exclusive hotel partner for the 2019 Arts and Letters Live series. Promotional support is provided by KERA. Many thanks to the DMA staff, our dedicated volunteers, and to you, our loyal audience, for making the Arts and Letters Live series possible. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Lois Kim, who will moderate the conversation with Celeste this evening. Lois serves as Executive Director of Texas Book Festival in Austin. An immigrant from Seoul, Korea, Lois grew up in Williamsville, New York. She holds a bachelor's degree in English from the University of Michigan and a master's degree and PhD in English from the University of Texas at Austin. She has been a member of her book club for more than 20 years, and favorite book genres are contemporary literature, literary fiction, and the 19th century novel. Please join me in welcoming Lois Kim.
Good evening. Can y'all hear me okay? Thank you, Michelle, for that exceedingly kind and generous introduction. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this special evening. It's an honor, truly an honor, to be here to talk with Celeste Ng at Arts and Letters Live. I was lucky enough to meet Celeste last October when she was one of our keynote speakers at our Texas Book Festival Gala and also one of our headlining authors at our annual festival. So it is a real treat to be able to get to be with her again this evening with you all. I do hope that you will all think about joining me in Austin this coming fall, the weekend of October 25th and 27th, to experience the gala and the festival for yourselves. I also do want you to know that the Texas Book Festival has been expanding our outreach outside of Austin, primarily through our outreach programs, Reading Rockstars and Real Reads. These are impactful programs that connect young people to authors and their books. In fact, we were just up here in the Dallas and Fort Worth area in February, serving 4 Title I elementary schools and 1 high school, bringing authors to these schools and giving every student a signed copy of the author's book. And we hope to grow these programs more in the future, so I did want to let you know about that. Before I welcome Celeste to the stage, I just want to express my thanks to everyone here who supports literature and the literary arts. There's no other art form quite like it in its portability, and therefore its power to reach everyone. I mean no disrespect to the incredible art housed in this stunning museum, but I'm not going to be taking that Rauschenberg or Pollock home with me tonight. But we all can and should take Celeste's art home with us tonight. Was that a book sales plug? Yes, it was. I feel very fortunate to work for an organization that Laura Bush founded 24 years ago to support authors and libraries. I love that the Texas Book Festival, like Arts and Letters Live, champions the act of reading and creates opportunities for authors and readers to connect in meaningful ways. It's such a promising time in literary publishing right now, with so many important and diverse voices being heard and celebrated. Authors like Celeste Ng, whose psychologically rich portraits of families and communities expand our empathy and our humanity. Celeste Ng was raised in both Pittsburgh and Shaker Heights, Ohio. She holds a bachelor's degree from Harvard University and earned her MFA from the University of Michigan, which, as Michelle said, is also my alma mater, where she won the Hopwood Award while in graduate school. Her fiction and essays have appeared in the New York Times, One Story, and The Guardian, just to name a few of the notable publications in which she has appeared. And she's the recipient of the Pushcart Prize and a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. Celeste's first novel, Everything I Never Told You, published in 2014, was a New York Times bestseller, a New York Times Notable Book of 2014, and Amazon's #1 Best Book of 2014. The novel also won the Massachusetts Book Award, the Asian Pacific American Award for Literature, the ALA's Alex Award, and the Medici Book Club Prize. Little Fires Everywhere was published by Penguin Press in September 2017 and is a New York Times bestseller, Amazon's #2 Best Book and Best Fiction of 2017, and was named a Best Book of the Year by over 25 publications. It was also the winner of the Goodreads Reader Choice Award 2017 in fiction and has been or is being published abroad in more than 20 countries. The novel is being produced by Reese Witherspoon's production company and put into a dramatic limited miniseries forthcoming. So I hope you will all join me in welcoming Celeste Ng. Hi, Celeste.
Hi, Lois. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's really kind.
I'm going to put these right here. We're doing the beer thing, right?
Yes. So I've been doing a lot of book events, and one of the tips that the techs who have to wire me for sound told me is that you drink the beer, you don't hold the beer. Because if you hold the beer, nobody can hear you. So that's why we're doing this. So I learned something, and now you all learned that too.
Just so you guys know, some of the tips learned on the road. I think first I just want to take a quick poll, because how many of you have already read Little Fires Everywhere? Okay, huge. All right, that feels like the majority. How about Everything I Never Told You? Okay, great.
This is so we know what we can spoil and not spoil.
Yes, right. It's kind of like Game of Thrones, but not, right? Okay. Now we all know. So I'm just going to start by asking Celeste a question about kind of just a really foundational question, right? Like, how did you come to writing? And can you tell everyone, as I know that they want to know, because it's always what I want to know, how your path to becoming a writer?
Yeah, I was a really early reader. I was just always fascinated by stories and books, and I was always the kid who, rather than going and playing on the playground, was sitting with a book in the corner, completely absorbed and very happy. And as soon as I learned to read, I basically started to write my own stories. And I would write little poems, I would write plays and make my cousins perform them. And then we would charge our parents admission, and we would split up the proceeds. And they actually, my cousins have still not forgotten this. So when I see them, they're like, so we get a cut of all of your royalties, right? But so I think I was just raised to be a reader. I grew up in a family of readers. Even though my parents were in the sciences, they loved reading. And so going to the bookstore or the library on a weekend was just a family activity. And I didn't think that I could be a writer as a career until maybe about a year after my first book came out. It was only at that point that I thought that maybe this would actually work out. I'm the child of immigrants. My parents came over from Hong Kong in the 1960s, and you sort of have to be practical when you're an immigrant. And so I always had this idea that writing was more of a hobby than a job, that it wasn't something that you could really make a living off of. And so I spent a lot of my childhood planning other careers. So first I was going to be a paleontologist, and I was going to write on the side. And then I was going to be an astronaut and write on the side. And then I realized that those are not practical career choices either. So then I was going to be a journalist and write on the side. And I realized that I'm too shy to be a journalist. So then I was going to become an English professor and write on the side. And it wasn't until I was applying to PhD programs that a mentor said to me, you keep saying on the side, what if you just give yourself a little time and try it? And what happens if you put that in the front? And that was sort of my route to writing, really, was trying everything else first and then realizing that this was the thing I had to do.
That's fantastic. And do you feel like and your parents weren't pressuring you to follow a certain career path or another career path?
I think they would have liked me to go into the sciences, and at the time, I think I've definitely felt it was pressure. But I think in looking back, it was more sort of them recognizing, like, these are the things that we know. This is the world we know. This is the stuff we know how to help you with. And if you go off the map, we don't know how to help you. And that's a really scary thing for a parent to feel. You know, I think there were probably times in my adolescence that I thought, oh, you know, you don't care about books, or you don't care about that, which is ridiculous because our house was overflowing with books. But I think for a lot of it, it was, you know, they wanted me to go into the sciences because I was good at it, but it was also sort of the route they knew. So they knew that they could warn me about the pitfalls. You know, they're like, you go to this, you can study this. We know the good schools. We know people who can help you. And in the world of writing, they just didn't have any idea. And so I'm really grateful in the end that they said, okay, we see this is what you want to do. And they kind of let me go off and have that space.
I think that that's always also interesting as far as I was reading something that you had said when you were talking about how your mother had really helped sort of facilitate taking you to bookstores and taking you to libraries, and also looking for diversity, right? That she was a mother who really tried to find sort of Asian role models for you, which I think is interesting. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I didn't realize that my mother was doing that until I was maybe a teenager. But throughout my childhood, which was in the 80s, she was always looking for books that were about Asians, especially Asian girls, or that were by Asians, or that had something to do with Asia. So I got a lot of books by Catherine Patterson, who is not an Asian but writes a lot about Japan in particular. I got books that were memoirs by a woman who had been interned in Japanese internment camps during World War II, and she wrote basically sort of fictionalized memoirs about them for children. And I didn't understand why my mother was giving me all of these books. And it wasn't until I got older that I sort of realized, like, oh, she felt it was very important for me to be able to see myself in a book, to be able to know that these were stories that it was okay to tell, that it was maybe important to tell. And so she really, I think, went out of her way to find children's books, but also books by Amy Tan, before Amy Tan, Betty Bell Lord, Maxine Hong Kingston, a woman named Jade Snow Wong, who I feel like has sort of been forgotten. But she would find these stories, especially about Asian women, as I think a way of telling me that what the experience that we were living through was as worthy of being told as anybody else's.
That's amazing, and kudos to your mom for being a pioneer. I'm a little older than Celeste, and I feel like that in my immigrant story, it was very much about assimilating to the point, like, I mean, I was like, Little House on the Prairie, you know, Little Women, Pippi Longstocking, like Charlotte, like it doesn't get whiter than the Narnia, like than what I read. You know, like it doesn't get whiter than what I read growing up.
I think my mom was a really interesting case in this, because she grew up in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is now technically part of China, and everyone there is ethnically Chinese, but for a long time it was a colony of Great Britain. So my mom grew up in the British school system. She had sort of British and dual citizenship for a while until she immigrated to the United States. So she grew up with a lot of these British classics, and so I also got, my mom also really loves the Newbery Award. So anything that won the Newbery Award was an automatic buy for her. So I I also had, like Little Women. I had like The Five Little Peppers and How They Grew, which was another like super white book, like Betsy Tacy. And I love those books. I actually am reading the Little House books with my son right now. So I grew up with those things too. But I think during the time that I was growing up, the message really was for a long time for Asian immigrants, assimilate, meaning don't do anything that could be remotely considered Asian. Don't learn the language, eat only American food, just basically act like an American, whatever that means, right? And I'm looking back now, I'm sort of impressed that my parents were always, at least at home, very firm, like, okay, you are also Chinese, and here are these things that we have. And although I don't feel that I know as much about the culture as I want to, I'm glad that they didn't try to disavow that for me.
Yeah, I think and it's a really interesting moment, because I think for different kind of immigrant generations and children of immigrant, you're looking back at your past and thinking about the ways that you've erased your ethnic identity, and then you're rediscovering it. And it's a popular time, going back to if you're reading Little House to your son, it's still one of my favorite series, right? Because it's perfect in our maker culture, like everyone can make their own butter, or
he's
so
into the making of the food and the weaving of the cloth. I did not expect that he was going to have all these questions about weaving full cloth, but now I know so much about weaving full cloth.
It's all about the cloth,
yeah.
Right, and the general store, for sure. So that's and I know you guys will maybe also have some questions, but I kind of want to dive into some of the amazing sort of structure, and I'm feeling confident that this is just totally an audience who knows both books. So I think we're just going to kind of go there with some of the themes. So and we're going to kind of go between both novels, but of course I know we'll probably focus on Little Fires. But I do want to start with a question about, in both novels, right? They both start with the ending, right? Like they both have these big dramatic endings, and that kickstarts the story. So can you talk a little bit about that decision, and were you always planning to do that, and just sort of the dramatic beginning of knowing what happens?
So when I started writing Everything I Never Told You, it actually had a different beginning. If any of you have read it, it starts off, Lydia is dead, but they don't know this yet. So it tells you right away that the middle daughter of this family has died, and it points the reader at the question of not, is she alive, is she dead, but how did we get here, which is, for me, the more interesting question. And the book didn't always start that way. It actually started off, at first they don't know where Lydia has gone. And neither did the reader. For about 40 or 50 pages, you would watch this family search for their daughter. And I kept struggling with this because it didn't feel quite right. And I eventually realized that it was pointing the reader in the wrong direction. It was making them think that this was a mystery story to be solved, rather than a story about the family and their dynamics and how we got here. And a writer friend of mine, who we would meet up periodically to complain about our problems in our manuscripts, she said, is there any reason that you're not saying that up front? And I said, well, I can't tell them what happens so early. And she's like, but that's not actually the story. What happens, the question is not whether she's dead or not. So you should put that up front in the first chapter. And I thought about it, and after a while, I eventually put it right in the first sentence. And what I think that does, and why as soon as I did that, it felt like the right move, even as I was a little bit hesitant to give away the story in the first sentence, so to speak, It put the reader in a position of knowing more than the characters in the book do. So it lets you as the reader know there's more here happening, and you're going to be able to put the pieces together, even though this is a story about a family that isn't going to be able to put all those pieces together. And so when I got to my second book, Little Fires Everywhere, I didn't even realize that I was doing the same thing. But I tell you at the beginning that there is a house fire. You start with the end of the book, and then you move back in time, and you see how the characters got there. And for me, again, that works because when I'm reading, and I'm a huge reader still myself, I think of myself as a reader first and foremost, I want to know that we're going somewhere interesting. I want to know that this story that we're going to read is going to have consequences, that the people in it are going to be changed, and that something is going to be irreversibly changed for these characters' lives. And I think of it a little bit as if you're going on a trip with a friend. If your friend says, hey, get in the car, we're going on a trip, and you say, where are we going? And they say, I'll tell you later. You're going to have a lot of questions. And the whole time that you're driving, you'll be kind of guessing, okay, we didn't go down that street, so we're not going there. Okay, we're going on the highway, so we could be going here. You're not going to be sort of sitting back and enjoying the trip. You're going to be just wondering all the time, where are we going somewhere that I want to go to? If your friend says, hey, get in the car, we're going to go have dinner at this new restaurant, and then we're going to go and see, a play. You can decide maybe you don't want to do that. But if you do want to do that, if you think that sounds pretty good, you'll get in and you'll relax and you'll enjoy the evening. And I think that's how it is with a book, too, that if you tell the reader up front, we're going over here, the reader might decide, okay, that's not the book for me, which is fine. But they might also go, I'm interested and I'm in. And then they'll sit back. And in some ways, that's the way of sort of signaling to the reader, like, I'm going to tell you a story and I promise it's going to be interesting.
And there's a mystery that's revealed in the beginning, because you're not wanting to have it just be that kind of like, I'm just reading for the plot of what the mystery is. But your books are mysterious because they're mysteries of character, right? Like the kind of mystery and there's so much. Like a lot of novels have families and family dynamics, but what is so striking to me about the way that you do characters is that, especially family, is the kind of unknowability of the other, especially between parents and children. And it seems that this unknowability can be very destructive and potentially harmful. That when parents, in particular, believe they're doing what's for the best by kind of keeping secrets and not revealing their own personal narratives and their own past to kind of protect their children, the children do seem to suffer from that, right? And from not knowing the full story. So there is a mystery element, and would love to hear you talk more about how you see that role of sort of like the parents sort of withholding and the kind of whether that is collateral damage on the kids or not, and just that aspect of everyone's in their own place, not sharing everything.
Yeah, I think what brings me to writing always is people. I'm interested in people. I'm interested in how we work. You know, the more people I meet in real life and even on Twitter and, through getting to talk to readers, the more I sort of think how interesting and funny and smart and also weird and mysterious we are as individuals. When I start writing, I'm always starting from a place of not understanding. There's a situation that I don't understand, and usually that's what fascinates me. It might be a character who does something, and I go, why on earth would you think that was a good thing to do, right? Or you end up in a situation, and I go, how did you end up here with all of these things happening? And that's for me when I know that I've got a story. And so the story for me is always kind of about unraveling those mysteries of people. And for most of those cases, that has to do with who they are, and often that's shaped by the kind of life they've lived, the experiences that they've had. And in particular, family. More and more, I think I recognize how much of an influence my family had on me, largely for the good, but also in less good ways. There are definitely weird tics that my husband will point out. He's like, you're doing that thing that you got from your mom. And he's right. I see my sister doing that. As we get older, I think this thing happens that you try really hard to not turn into your parents in certain ways, and then usually you end up turning into your parents anyway. And I'm seeing that happen with both my sister and me. Every time my mother and my sister and I are together, so my father passed away some years ago, I'm struck by how both of us are turning into our mother in completely opposite directions. And not the ways that I predicted either. So I'm really interested in that idea of how parents influence their children, and particularly because I'm not only a daughter, I'm also a mother now. And I have an 8.5-year-old. The half has recently become extremely important to him. So I'm trying to correct myself, because if he hears me say 8 years old, I will get yelled at. So I have an 8.5-year-old, and there are a lot of things about him that I see reflections of myself in, or reflections of my mother or my father. There are also a lot of things in him where I'm like, where did you get that from? He's really good with music. And so while I've been on tour, my husband, who also is somewhat musical, was like, we're gonna do some music theory with him, so because my son keeps composing little songs, and this is something that I have no idea how to do. And my son can kind of figure out how to write down a melody. He can hear a melody and he can write it down, or he can. He's like, oh yeah, okay, so it's got these flats in it, so that's A flat major, and I don't know how he knows this. And there's something really weird, wonderfully weird, but weird about seeing your kid do things that you don't know, you didn't teach them, and that you don't understand. And it makes me think a lot about sort of how mysterious parents and children can be to one another, as you were saying, Lois. Like, I think about my parents who must have come to this kid who was always making up stories and go, where did she get that from? And the challenge is sort of then, how do you come to an understanding of a kid who's maybe different than you are, and how do you support them without, maybe feeling like you're just shoving them out in a little boat all on their own. So this is just the well that I think I keep coming back to, and the longer that I, am a parent, the older my son gets, the more sort of mysterious this relationship becomes to me. I'm kind of amazed that we manage to parent children at all, frankly.
Well, what I'm hearing is also a deep love and affection for your son, and you don't seem conflicted about being a mother, unlike some of your characters who seem a little conflicted about being mothers, right? And what that means to make that choice or be mothers, and does that mean you can't pursue your dreams and you can't pursue your career? And that seems like a through line in Maryland,
yeah,
and
I think in both books.
In
really,
both books, for sure, and in Mia and in Elena.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about the conflicted mothers.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be maybe overly generous to me to say that I'm not conflicted about being a mother. I very much wanted to be a mother. I'm very grateful that I got to choose the time that I got to become a mother at a time that I felt that I was ready. But I also recognized, even before my son was born, that it was going to change my life a lot. And I was okay with that, but it definitely has taken a lot of work to get to a balance point, and I don't even want to pretend that I've reached that balance point. I think it is my constant feeling about balancing my family life and my work life, and also just my own sort of personal inner life, is that I am constantly in danger of dropping something. But most of the time, it seems to be roughly in balance. Or I'll go, okay, so the past month I've been out of town for about 5 to 6 days out of every week, and then I go home on Sunday and I see my family and we have one meal together, and I repack my suitcase and then I go back out. So this month has been a very work-heavy month, but when I go home, I'm going to feel very much like I'm in home mode, and I may feel like I'm missing the work part, and I'll have to rebalance myself again. So the feelings of the mothers in both of my novels, where they are just, I think, reckoning with the demands of being a mother, wanting to have a life of their own, sometimes having a career of their own, or not getting to have a career of their own, are things that I definitely feel myself, and that I see in pretty much every woman I know. There's definitely a similar struggle for fathers, but I think that the struggle is slightly different for mothers, partly because we're usually the ones who carry the child, and because society has different expectations about what they want mothers to do and to be, and what they think mothers should maybe not be doing. And so I think that's part of how it comes into my books, because it's something that has so deeply affected my own life.
Well, and I think when you're writing about your amazingly rich portraits of mothers and characters, they're so firmly in a place, right? You were in Shaker Heights, and we're in places that resonate the times they are, and they are suburbs, right, in both cases. So do you feel like the struggles that mothers have in suburbs, right, like the way that the suburb figures into the American psyche, is that create the conflicts? Does it amplify the conflicts because there's such a strong sense of the neighborhoods and the places and the kind of social construct that you're depicting?
I grew up in the suburbs, and so they're a place that I know, and I very much, for better or for worse, feel that I'm part of the suburbs. But I think the suburbs do occupy this particular place in our culture because they're sort of the epitome of that idea that you can have it all. The suburbs, I think, were supposed to be the place where you could be close enough to the city and have all the benefits of the city, but also not have to live in the actual city, and where you could have space and some of the benefits of being in a small town or in the country, but you still maybe have a movie theater close by, and you can still have, I don't know, the bus system or whatever it was. It was this sort of idea that you could split the difference. And I think that that does resonate with me because as a woman, I'm constantly being told, you can have it all. And I'm not actually sure that you can have it all, but there is deeply ingrained in me this idea of trying to find that middle ground, of saying, like, okay, I can have a family, I can have children, I can, have a partner, but I can also have a career, and I can also travel for that work. I can take care of, these things in the house, but I can also be an intellectual and be accomplished. I can do all of these things. Somehow all of these things will fit together. And so I think that the fact that both of these books is set in the suburbs it's a reflection of that idea that these are women who are struggling with that notion that I think women have been fed for a long time, that you can have it all. Mm-hmm. And you should have it all, and you should want to have it all. And if you're not having it all, you did something wrong, so you should recalculate. It's a tough position to be in. And
it's a place where everyone, everyone knows everyone, and it also has, I think, there's a lot of a feeling of social class, right, and affluence and proximity to wealth, but not wealth, right? And so it's like in a Jane Austen novel, you're always in the parsonage, but not at Lady Catherine's, right? Like
exactly.
That feeling.
It's another place, too, where I think that idea that you can have it all, you get, it's the flip side of that, which is you get the downsides of being in the city, which is that I think when you live in the country, as some of my husband's extended family does, I mean, they live in the farm area, and you know your neighbors, and you kind of have to depend on them and build a relationship with them in ways that you don't have to in the city. In the city, you can be very anonymous, which can be very freeing, but it can also be really isolating. And I think in the suburbs, you get the bad sides of both of those. You sort of know your neighbors, but you maybe don't know them as well. You might, if you're lucky, but there's that anonymity there at the same time that everybody kind of knows everyone else's business and you're kind of judging each other. It's the downside of both of those things.
Talk about how oblivious is Elena of her own awareness of her social class, and what about Mia? Does she care about it at all? Like, what are there, as you drew them up, like, how much knowledge were you going to give them of the kind of social capital and true capital it takes to sort of be in the world and how they're interfacing with that?
Yeah, I think that Elena Richardson in particular, who's the matriarch of the family that lives in Shaker Heights, this very affluent suburb, which is a real place, I think that she thinks she's aware of what her position is, and I think she thinks she's aware of her privilege, but I think she actually is not. And that's sort of the most dangerous thing. There's this saying that, to know what you do not know is the beginning of true knowledge. Sounds like it should have come from a fortune cookie. But I think that that's actually true, and I think that the converse is true as well. If you don't even know that you don't know something, that's often when you get yourself into trouble. And so Elena Richardson thinks that she knows what her position is. She thinks that she's the benevolent one, that she is the dispenser of charity. She thinks that she's being very self-aware, and yet the fact is that she doesn't even see when she says to her tenant and friend of her children's friends, I should hire you to come over and work at our house. She doesn't see the power disparity that's there. In some ways, I think she's told herself that she is so egalitarian that she doesn't notice what are actually kind of important differences. And I think there's a parallel in there to something that one of the characters says, that I don't see race. That idea that if you blind yourself to that, you mean it is a good thing, but maybe you're missing out on important context. I think with Mia, she's a little bit more aware of those dynamics because she's on the side with less power. And I think when you're on the side with less power, you're very often aware of what the people who have more power can do, are doing, and of how carefully you have to walk. She has her own blind spots as well. I don't think that they have to do so much with class as much as they may have to do with maybe emotions or maybe how she's raising her daughter, with those sorts of connections. But both of them have these blind spots that they're not even aware of, and that's part of why I found them fascinating characters to write.
Definitely. There are a lot of characters in both your novels, right? They're kind of pretty richly drawn worlds with, a lot of characters, a lot of, children and families. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how are there people, because everyone's going to always ask a writer, like, who am I in your work? And, what is your process for coming up with these characters? Because there are a lot of different plot lines in both books.
Yeah. When I did a reading in Shaker Heights, my hometown, where the Little Fires Everywhere is set, and a good friend of mine who I've known since we were 10 came, and as a joke, I wrote in his copy of the book, "Guess which character you are." And it really messed with him because he kept texting me as he read the book. He was like, "Am I this person? Am I this person?" And I'm like, no, I was just kidding. I should have just let him keep guessing, but the truth is that, as with many fiction writers, there are bits and pieces of each of the characters that are taken from real life. There are little mannerisms that I borrow because we're observing in the world. That's where a lot of our material comes from. But none of them are direct analogs. And a lot of that is because life doesn't fit itself neatly into the sort of molds that we want fiction to be in. A friend of mine who's a fiction writer refers to fiction as life editing, by which she means that the things that are messy and don't make sense or that are contradictory in real life, you can kind of smooth out in fiction. And you can make meaning out of what happens in real life in ways that, in real life you're like, I don't know why we had this fight. I don't know why I got divorced. I don't know why this person died. But in fiction, you can in some ways make meaning out of that. You can say, this person died, but I learned this thing from it, or it taught me something, or it opened me up to something, or at least made me realize I missed them, right? You can make a kind of meaning from it that sometimes it's harder to do in real life. And the same is true with characters. I think you can kind of smooth out people and you can borrow things from real life and put them in there. So I want my next book to have fewer characters because it is difficult to just keep track of who is who. It's not shaping up that way so far. But one of the things that was fun about it was to give each of the characters, even if they were very minor, their little moment in the spotlight. And so even if it is maybe the bailiff in the courtroom, it was fun to give him a little moment in which we get to see his humanity and we get to see him thinking about his own daughter and how that, what's going on around him makes him, appreciate her more or want to go and check in on her. That's sort of the joy of writing the large cast of characters, is getting to have all these sort of little glinting moments where each person gets to be in the spotlight for just a second. And
they are so human. I think that's why everyone's responded so much to the humanity of your characters, but they have such a hard time telling their closest people to them what is going on, right? Like the difficulty of communication, the difficulty of honesty, and that they're kind of in their own bubbles, right? And is that a truth that you find that you wanted to represent in fiction, that it's so hard to communicate and so hard to be emotionally truthful, even with the people that are closest to you?
It really is, and I didn't go into either book thinking I want to write about the difficulties of communication, but I think that your writing projects show you what you're obsessed with, and I realized that as I was writing this family, I was really interested in all the things that they were not able to say to each other. I come from a family where when I have a much older sister, and when she was growing up, the "I love you" was present, but not often explicitly said. And I think that's true in a lot of families. And then I came along, and for whatever reason, I was like, "Love you, Mom, love you, Dad, love you, sis," and they were like, "Oh, this is different." There's just that sense of like there was that explicitness, and it wasn't that they didn't love my sister, and it wasn't that they didn't show her, but it didn't come out verbally for whatever reason. And I've seen that more and more as I've gotten older in my friends, in other people, with my friends and their parents, that there are certain things that we all kind of know, and we sort of take them as a given, and we don't talk about them. And so sometimes they are things like "I love you" or "I'm really proud of you." Sometimes they are things like, "This thing that you do always drives me crazy, and I cannot get you to stop doing it. Can you please stop doing that?" But you can't say that. It can be really small things like, every year at Thanksgiving, you have to put out this decoration, and it really bothers me that you have to make a whole big fuss about whatever the thing is. And it's this long-standing thing, and the longer it goes, the harder it is to talk about it in some ways. But it really started to hit home for me when I had a son, and when we started to go through the 2, 3, 4-year-olds ages of use your words. I would find myself saying things to him like, "I can't read your mind. I know you have all these thoughts and these feelings, but the only way that they can get out of your head and into my head is if they come out of your mouth in words, and they go in my ear, and then they go into my brain, and they make them back into thoughts and feelings. That's the only way, because I failed mind reading class." And when I said that to him, this was really in kind of a moment of one of those frustrations where I'm like, "I don't understand why you're angry, and you need to tell me why you're angry." I realized that actually that's a problem that adults also have, right? That it is really hard for us sometimes, I think, to identify what we're actually feeling and then to explain why that happens. And that just seems like such a big part of human nature that it kind of amazes me that we're actually able to communicate anything to each other at all. When I put it that way, you have to say it in words. And so for me, this is sort of one of the big conundrums of existence, and one of the big human struggles is, how do we tell other people what we think or what we want?
And so that's a super universal thing. It's interesting, especially in Everything I Never Told You, you're kind of playing with a lot of Asian expectations of the family, and certain kind of interesting ways that, your own story is not Lydia's story, right? Where she's sort of this, supposed to be this phenom student, but she really isn't. Unlike Celeste here, who's like totally an overachiever, and we can all just feel really amazed by all of your accomplishments of being very studious and can do all these things. Lydia here cannot. And so I didn't know if some of the pieces were you're working out some of the kind of expectations or stereotypes around Asians, right?
Yeah.
And I will admit that there are ones that I think sometimes we embrace, right? And we like them. Like, I like to be the tiger mom, or, whatever it is, or, but then what are the costs of playing into those stereotypes? And I think you're doing that, and I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think there are certain sort of cultural factors that fit into it, some of which are accurate and some of which are more sort of expectations. But there are, at least in my experience growing up in a Chinese American family, there is this sort of idea that you don't share your business outside of the house. And I don't think that is, I don't think that's limited to Chinese American or Asian families, but there's the idea that, like, if you've got problems, you don't share your business with everybody else. You kind of solve it in the family. And likewise, I think that there are certain expectations, often in many East Asian cultures as well, that I'm trying to think of how to say this, that you have to kind of be very careful about who you share your thoughts with. And a lot of that, I think, often has to do particularly with immigrant families here. There were real reasons to not attract attention to yourself, to not stand out in any way that could possibly be seen as negative, to only sort of show the good things. When I was growing up, I was born in Pittsburgh, and then I moved to Cleveland, and neither of those areas has very many Asians. And so for a long time, I was one of the only people of color in Pittsburgh, and even in Cleveland was one of the few Asians that we knew. And I didn't fully realize until I got older that my parents, when they first moved to the United States, had moved right into the middle of the Rust Belt and had basically stayed there. And so they were in Lafayette, Indiana, which is not, even now, a particularly diverse place. Then they moved to outside the suburbs of Chicago. And I learned from later on from my parents and my sister that they had to deal with a lot more, I think, what we would think of as very overt discrimination than I had realized. Partly because I think it was unpleasant and they didn't want to talk about it. But, I learned a story from my sister that when they had moved to Pittsburgh, neighborhood kids had put cherry bombs in their mailbox and had blown the mailbox up. And so this was before I was born. And I remembered, the other instances from when I was a kid, but I didn't think much of it. And now I think back about my parents as new immigrants. They were in their early 20s. They had a baby. They were students. They had no family. To think about how maybe for them, showing any kind of sign of weakness might have been really dangerous for them. And so I think that is part of what influences the parents in Everything I Never Told You. The father is a Chinese American man and the mother is a white American woman, and they come at these things from very different perspectives. The mother sort of wants to stand out, and she doesn't understand why her husband is really sort of reticent to be noticed in any way. He just wants to assimilate, as we were talking about earlier. And so those were things that as I started writing the book and realizing what the issues in this family were, so to speak, I realized that those were things that I really wanted to try and tease apart.
And there's, and there's so much complexity in talking and tackling a, biracial family at a time where that wasn't common, and also in Little Fires Everywhere, of course, there's, the huge story that centers around the transracial adoption and the biological mother and the adoptee family. And, how did that work its way in? Was there sort of an origin story to that?
I knew that I wanted to look at how Asians fit into the question of race, because at least in the U.S., most of the time when we're talking about race, we are talking about black and white. And now I think we're starting to realize, there's a Latinx population and there's an Asian population, and that group itself has many different groups within it. But I've always felt like sort of a third or even a fourth party when we're talking about race, because I'm neither black nor white, and I don't fit into either of those groups. And so I thought that putting this question of transracial adoption in there would sort of bring all those issues up to the front, the ways that we look at Asians often as like, you're almost white, but not quite white. And there's something different, right? It's different. And so when I figured out that there was going to be a transracial adoption in the book, I started looking at different adoption cases, contested adoptions, and reading as much as I could about transracial adoptions and things like that. There was, when I was in Cleveland, when I was maybe 13 or 14, there was a case where there was a white family that wanted to adopt a Chinese American baby. And I remember that the Chinese community, such as it was in Cleveland, was very split about this. And I didn't remember anything else about the case. I just remembered talking to my mother about it and saying, I don't really understand what the problem is. If they're going to give her a good home, what's the problem? And my mother, as a Chinese American woman, was saying, well, I think that you have to think about the culture. And I didn't really know what she meant. And I didn't remember anything else about that case, but it came back to me, and I decided to invent my own story about how that might have played out.
That's great. Speaking of that, I think you guys, if you have also heard that, of course, this Little Fires Everywhere is being adapted by Reese Witherspoon into a series, and they just released the casting, and they have Kerry Washington playing Mia. So they have a black woman playing Mia who, in the novel does not, there's a marker for her being a person of color. And so be interested to hear what you think about that casting choice and what that does for the kind of racial politics and racial identity that might play out beyond the pages of your book.
Absolutely. The short version is that I'm thrilled about the casting. When I heard that Reese Witherspoon was interested in producing the book, and in starring as Elena Richardson. That was always the part that she was interested in, and that was actually sort of my dream goal for that. When my husband and I were watching Big Little Lies, I guess about 2 years ago, halfway through, I turned to him and I said, wouldn't it be amazing if somehow Reese Witherspoon read my book and then wanted to produce it and wanted to star as Elena Richardson? And this actually happened, and so now I feel like I should try and manifest more things. I should be like, wouldn't it be amazing if I had a pony? Or, I don't know what else, what else I should try and manifest. But they said, we're really interested in doing this, and so I talked with her, and I loved her vision for the book, and I felt like she got it. And she said, actually, I have an idea for somebody to play Mia, and let me approach her and see if she's interested. And it turned out she was, and it turned out that person was Kerry Washington. And when they told me, I was really surprised, but I also loved this because the truth is that when I was writing the novel, initially I had wanted to write Mia as a woman of color because I realized I was interested in writing about class and race, and for us in the United States, those things are very deeply intertwined. But I didn't want to make Mia an Asian American woman which is an experience I knew I could render, because it seemed a little too neat when I knew there was going to be a transracial adoption and it was going to involve an Asian baby. It seemed like the reader would go, well, of course the Asian woman will side with the Asian mother. But I didn't think that I was the right person. I didn't think that I had the right experience to render a Black woman's experience, or a Latina woman's experience. And so I thought of her, honestly, as a white character, and I wrote her with her in mind as white, but I didn't give her any particular racial markings. So I wrote her as a white character, and I loved that when Reese and Kerry read the book, they saw that there was an opportunity to cast her as a Black woman, because I think Kerry Washington is a great person to portray a Black woman's experience. And their reasons for doing that were, first, that Kerry Washington is awesome, but second, because they see the book, I think, as really discussing these issues of race and class, and they wanted to kind of pull those issues up. And I know that it's their intent to make the series a conversation starter, a place where I think people are going to have to talk about these issues. And so they're actually bringing more of that into the script to talk about, because now Pearl will also, she's going to be a biracial girl. And they're going to talk about sort of what that means. And I think when you see this on screen, I think the questions that are in the book will become sort of even more apparent and obvious and important to talk about.
It's fascinating that you originally imagined Mia as a person of color, and that here it's coming full circle, and she is. And it sort of is a big topic in publishing right now and in writing, which is about who can tell sort of what stories. And I think there's kind of a healthy debate about this. Like, writers are people who make up stuff, right? Who get into the minds of characters, create identities. And so why can't a white woman write a person of color's point of view? Or why can't, like this is a very active debate right now in publishing.
Very active.
So,
I feel like there have been a number of cases in which authors have been criticized, especially young adult authors, about this. And I think it's a really important discussion to have, and I'm glad they've been having it. I mean, my feeling about it is like, yes, we're fiction writers, and our job is to imagine someone else's being. So I have never been a mother of 4 children living in Shaker Heights, right? Like, that is a leap from my own experience. But for me, the question, I think, really comes down to, why is this an important story to tell? And what is your own connection to the story? And so for me, I feel like when I'm writing the characters that I have in the books, there is a point of connection that makes them important. Mrs. Richardson is also a mother. She is also a person who is struggling with being a woman in the suburbs, with balancing her career, with being a perfectionist, which frankly I am, and I'm working on it. But she's struggling with those things, and those, that's my route into her. I think that for writers, it's not as easy as the question of anybody can write whatever they want to. This is true. You can write whatever you want to, but I think the question is, are you doing the work to actually empathize with that character and understand them? I think in the cases where people actually do that, you hear very little complaint. Mm-hmm. And the reason that sometimes people complain about people who are writing well outside of their own background is often when it's not done right. And I think it's also then the writer's responsibility to listen. If you write an experience that's not yours, and someone who has had a similar experience says, you know what, that didn't ring true for me, I think it's important that you have to listen to that feedback. So there's no sort of like, yes, anybody can write whatever they want and not get criticized for it. Mm-hmm. But there's also, I think there is space for writing outside what you know and being respectful about it and doing that work properly. I think ultimately the writer's job is to find empathy in all their characters. Even if you don't like what a character does or you think you don't agree, I think it's important that you at least understand them. And it's then your job also to create that same empathy in your reader. And if you haven't done that, then it is a reasonable thing to be criticized about.
I love that answer, and it sort of speaks to the responsibility of being a writer, right? That there's not just, you're not isolated in your writing. It is, by definition, going to be a communal act, right? You're going to put it in the world, and a community of people are going to read it. So sort of to do it thoughtfully and to do the work to do it is, I think, something that I agree with. And, in my job, it's sort of like I see a lot of writers, and there's a community of writers, and I think what's your journey been like seeing kind of like the writing landscape today, right? Like the community of writers who you've gotten to know through writing. It feels like a really promising time. And do you feel that way too?
I do. I'm really optimistic about it. I recently got to do an interview with Lauren Groff, who is a friend, but she happens to be in Cambridge where I live, so we did an event together. And she did this really lovely thing where she said, she went to the Paris Review and the interviews that they had done with people like John Cheever and John Updike, and a lot of white middle-class men. And she took the questions that they had been asked and she asked them of me. And I had never been asked these questions before. And one of them was, how do you feel about the state of American literature? And I loved that because I don't think I've ever seen a woman get asked that question, frankly. And my answer was that I feel fairly optimistic about it because I think that we're starting to realize how important it is to just have many different stories get told, not even necessarily in terms of ethnicity, although that's part of it, but just different stories of people who have different backgrounds, stories of people who have different experiences, and that adds something to our cultural fabric. And I think that we're starting to see those stories come out and then also get embraced. So I'm thinking about like Tommy Orange's book, They're There, which is he's a Native American writer, and that book has done really well and has found a lot of readers. And I think a lot of people have been able to see a culture that they didn't know about and learn something and empathize, or if they do have a connection, that they've been able to see themselves. And I think that fiction that works in both of those directions, as it's called sometimes being a mirror, that you get to see your own experience reflected and validated, or as a window where you get to see something outside of what you know, I think it's really important. And I think there's been more and more of that in recent years, which I think is fantastic.
So you mentioned Tommy Orange. Who else are you really excited to be reading right now?
There's a great book that I just finished reading, so it's cheating with your question a little bit. But I've been recommending it everywhere because I think it's honestly a book that I wish that every American would read. It's called Good Talk. The author's name is Mira Jacob. She's an Indian American woman who lives in New York, and it's a graphic memoir. But if you're thinking, I don't know what a graphic memoir is, or I don't read graphic novels, like this, I still hope that you will peek at this in the library or the bookstore anyway. It's the good talks of the title are conversations that she's having with her son, who is multiracial, about being brown in America. So the author's husband is white, and their son is part white and part Indian. And what happened during the 2016 election is that their family really started to split. And one set of grandparents became very strong Trump supporters, and the others, this was really at odds with sort of how the family's feeling. And the book is not about Trump versus anyone else, but the book is sort of about what do you do when you really love someone in your family and they love you and yet you don't see eye to eye, and how do you explain that to your children, and how do you make sure that you can still hold on to the things that do bind you together as a family. I mean, that's what the book is really about. And I have never read anything like it. And as someone who is in an interracial marriage, and, you know, thinks a lot about these sort of issues, it was a really beautiful and moving and also quite frankly funny book. Her kid is hilarious in this book, and it kind of gave me hope for the future to read it in a way that I wasn't getting a lot from the news.
Mira Jacob is really psyched right now because she just got a great.
It's really a wonderful book, and she happens to be a friend that I knew through her writing first. Our novels came out at the same time, but then I read this book, and I was just blown away by it. And it is sort of a book that I feel like really is about what it means to be American now. How do you deal with people who you care about who have different opinions than you do? And that, I feel like, is maybe the biggest issue that we're wrestling with right now as a country.
That sounds like a great read. I certainly feel, Celeste, you were saying how you're a reader first, and anytime I meet and have the opportunity to talk to a writer, it's always about what they're reading, right? Like that they're just still fangirl and fanboys about writers, right? And other books.
This is one of the things that I love about going to writing festivals, that we get to meet each other, writers. Like usually it's us alone in our houses, like by ourselves. And when we actually get to meet each other, there's a ridiculous amount of just sort of fangirling and fanboying going on.
I know that, is it a good time to segue to questions? Because I know y'all might have some questions for Celeste.
I saw a hand fly up.
Lights are going to come up. And this has been, it's been so fun to just talk about books and Celeste's books and her brilliant novels, but I know that you guys probably have some questions, so we want to turn it over to y'all to ask your questions.
Hi. First of all, I wanted to say, as an Asian American woman, I also grew up in a very white state, Utah, in the 90s, and the books I grew up with were Sweet Valley.
Sorry, can you hold the microphone closer to your mouth?
Remember the beer.
Drink, drink the beer.
Okay.
I first wanted to say, as an Asian American woman, I really like seeing a lot of books published by Asian women, and I really loved their stories. And also, as an Asian American woman who grew up in a very white state, Utah, in the 90s with babysitter clubs and boxcar children, I really wanted to see more of myself in books, and I'm glad that now we get to see a lot of Asian women writers. So I wanted to thank you for that. But my question was, on Instagram, we do have a very small community called Bookstagram, where, as nerdy as it sounds, we only post about books. And there's a huge movement right now going on about promoting diverse literature and promoting Own Voices review. So I'm really glad you guys brought that up. But my question to you was, as a woman of color, I kind of wanted to hear your experience in the publishing industry and kind of the difficulties that you may have faced.
This is a great question and a very meaty one. I was really nervous before I actually had published anything because I had the feeling that I was going to be neatly labeled in a box that maybe didn't fit me. I actually wrote an essay about this fear called Why I Don't Want to Be the Next Amy Tan. And it came back to bite me, honestly, because fairly recently I got to interview Amy Tan for the Washington Post. And I felt like I needed to bring this up because if I didn't, it was just going to be weird. And if she already knew about it, then I really needed to bring it up. But it was really great to get to talk to her about this because what I was trying to say in the essay was that we often have this idea about what Asian women, also Indian American women, brown women, gay people, any particular group are supposed to be writing. And what I had noticed was that a lot of times any time an Asian American woman, especially an East Asian woman, would publish anything, she would be lauded as the next Amy Tan, which was a problem for me because not everybody writes like Amy Tan. Not everybody should write like Amy Tan. Like they're going to have different stories. And the idea that you're going to be the next anybody kind of makes it sound like you're going to replace them. You're going to knock them off the top of the mountain so that you can be king of the mountain. And I didn't like that idea that there could only be this one person who was the representative of all of this whole group. And so I was really nervous about this, and I'm very fortunate that my publishing experience has been really actually very fantastic, and none of the things that I worried about happened. I was really worried when my first novel came out. First, I was worried nobody would want to buy it because it was about a mixed race family, and it was about Asians, and I wasn't sure anyone, maybe even Asians, would want to read this book. And I was really happy that it was embraced as a story about family. It's a particular family, but that it reached wider audiences. And I was really worried that this thing that often happens on the covers of books by non-white women in particular was going to happen, which is that you often get like the back of a woman's head. If you're a South Asian woman, she's usually in a sari. If you're an African woman, there's this one particular tree that has shown up on multiple book covers. There's, sometimes there are bamboo leaves. There are certain tropes that we use to signal what the book's content is, and I was really worried about that. And I was really happy when both the hardcover and the paperback cover that they settled on nod to what's in the book, but not in a sort of like, here are your pandas and your bamboo. Like, we're signaling. I mean, it's sort of, I'm sort of joking, but I'm also sort of not. And then I was really happy that the book was read in the way that I wanted it to be read. It was read as both a story about race, but also a story about more than that. It was a story about particular family and a particular group of people. And that largely, I think, had to do with the fact that I got to work with people who sort of saw the book in the way that I did. I happen to have, I'm at a publisher, Penguin Press, that publishes a lot of nonfiction, but they're very sort of globally oriented. And so I think they're always thinking in terms of a world perspective. And I think that affected how they looked at my book. My agent is in an interracial marriage. She's a white woman, her husband is black, and they have multiracial children. And I think that really made her aware of a lot of the issues around race. My publicist is an Asian woman, and she is part Chinese and part Japanese. And I think that made her aware of both what it might be like to be an Asian woman and also intercultural conflicts. And so I think because that was a group of people that had shared certain pieces of that experience, they were able to put this book forward in a way that felt really positive and organic to me. And I think that speaks to sort of why it's important to have diversity in multiple industries, because people have different experiences and they see different things and they bring different things out. So thank you, that was a wonderful question. Is that the only question? Okay, there's questions over here somewhere. I'm going to do this so I can see you.
Sorry. I teach high school English, and for the past 2 years, my students have read your book, and we really enjoyed it. So, one, they wanted to say thank you. But my question is, in Little Fires Everywhere, you do such a great job of showing both sides to BB and Mrs. McCullough, objectively stating who would be the better mother, I guess, and you offer, the same number of paragraphs, the same number of pages to each one to show how each would be a good mother. I guess I wanted to know is, are you, in your heart, Team BB or Team McCullough?
Yep. All right, thank you, Lois. First, thank you for teaching high school English. Seriously, I feel like you deserve a round of applause. I'm being completely sincere and not pandering, because my high school English teachers were hugely important figures to me, as were my earlier English teachers. But the number of people that I know who say, my English teacher saved my life by giving me this book that I needed at a time that I needed it, I think it's a hard job, but I'm very glad that you do it. So thank you, and thank you for teaching the book. In terms of who I think would be the better mother, I honestly am divided. I'm honestly not sure. And it's interesting because when I started writing the novel, I felt fairly strongly, I think because I am a biological mother, I felt it was easy for me to imagine my way into BB, who is the biological mother in the book who wants to get her baby back. And I gave pages of the draft to my writing group, and they said, okay, we're reading this and we feel like the novel is pushing us to be on BB's side. Is that what you want? If it's not, you may need to go back. And I thought about it for a while, and I thought, I don't want the novel to have an agenda. People are going to have different feelings, but there are reasons that Mrs. McCullough, who is the woman who would like to adopt this Chinese-American baby, there are reasons that she thinks of herself as the baby's mother. And they're pretty valid, too. And so I actually had to go back, and this ties to what we were saying about sort of doing the work of writing outside your own experience. I had to kind of imagine my way into her mind and present how she saw things. And I had to find the moments of connection with someone who I thought I disagreed with. And passages that describe sort of Mrs. McCullough walking the baby when the baby, is sick, or taking care of the baby. I mean, those are things that I remember doing. And I thought, if I had a baby that wasn't mine and I had, biologically mine, and I had done this, I think I would feel like I was this baby's parent. And so it was, for me, a sort of reminder that I have to go back and do the work of empathizing with all of the characters. And so my honest answer is that I'm Team Solomon. You just cut straight down the middle, and no one will be happy. There's a question over here, I think. Yeah.
Hi, I was just wondering, it's not a very in-depth question, but what is your writing process like?
Oh, sure. I'm happy to talk about that. I used to be very precious about my writing process. I would go, I don't feel inspired today. I'm going to go to the art museum instead. I'm going to read a book. And then once I had my son, I realized that I could not do that anymore. I had to be more disciplined. So now my writing day, I'll answer in two parts. One is sort of how my day goes, and one is about how I actually get the writing done. My husband does school drop-off, so they go off to school and work, and I go to my office, and I sit down and start writing, and then I usually, on a good day, I can write 4 or 5 hours, and then I'm usually tapped out, and I do all the other boring stuff like answer emails and things like that. And that's how I've been doing it, is to try and treat it like a job, which now I'm lucky that it is. In terms of the creative side, what I really do is I try and get to know my characters. I get to know them like I would get to know somebody that I meet at a party. And so if you met somebody at a party, you'd say, what do you do? Where do you live? Do you watch Game of Thrones? Do you just ask about who they are and what they're interested in, and then you start to get to know their family, and you say, oh, do you, are you still close with your parents? Do you see them a lot? Oh, you don't. Why not? Or you start to get a sense of what their issues are. And that's sort of how I get to know my characters. I will write about things that, their formative memories, or things that bother them, or about, what their day might be like. And a lot of it doesn't go into the book, but that's how I figure out what the story is. And so a lot of my writing process is just kind of getting to know those characters and figuring out what it is that they are dealing with. So that's the boring answer. Yeah, over here, and then we'll come here. Yes.
So following on to that, do you have several books in your head at one time, or do you focus on one book at a time? Or do you have several characters that you're like, I'm going to write 10 books with these characters in my head? Or how do you get to the point where you decide what you're going to write?
Yeah. Right now, I have 2 books that are in my head, and I'm really struggling with it because I don't know which one to pay attention to. But usually I have just one story, and usually what happens is I know that that's the story that I need to work with when that's the only thing that I can think about. And there's a moment where the story kind of gains enough mass that it has momentum, and everything sort of starts to stick to it. So for me, usually it's a matter of kind of finding what that story is and kind of building onto it. Right now, because I've got these 2 stories that are thematically related but are very different in plot, I'm actually sort of struggling with which one to work on, and this is new for me. So after I'm finished getting to go on book tour, I'm hoping to take this summer to pick a lane and follow it and see where it goes. Yeah. Oh, okay, we've got a question here, and then over here. Yeah.
Hi, amazing to hear about your writing process. Before I came this evening, I tried to read up a little bit on you, and whether or not it was correct, Wikipedia claimed that one of your favorite books was The God of Small Things. And it led me to the question. It led me to the question about, you write about reality in a very specific way. And when I think of God of Small Things, I think of fantasy. And while the theme is family, it's a very, very different genre. And do you see yourself moving beyond the way you write today? Do you see yourself taking a risk to write in a new way? Or how do you think about that as one of your favorite books?
So that is true. The God of Small Things is one of my favorite novels, and I reread it at least in part, but often I end up rereading the whole thing pretty much every year. It's interesting that you think about it as fantasy, because I think about it as being really sort of deeply ingrained in sort of like the family dynamics. But to answer the larger question, I would like in every book, I hope I will write more than these two, and I would like in every book to try and do something different, because for me, I want to be challenging myself. I don't want to just do the same thing, because I learn a lot when I write. And so I think if I am not doing something new, I'm probably not learning anything. And learning is part of why I actually write. So in both of the two ideas that I'm toying with, there's something new that I'm trying, and it's sort of the question of which one is the least scary path to take at this point. Okay, thank you. Oh, yes.
Hello? Okay, there it goes. So in your books and as well as on your Twitter, you're a big champion of immigration and being a child of immigrants, being a minority. Do you think that's something that you're going to continue following in your writing or in your personal life?
In terms of in my writing, I think it probably will be something that will at least be one of the themes, because it has been so much a part of my own experience in my own life. And I realize that it's shaped how I think about myself and how I think about my country more deeply than I had realized. In November of 2016, after the election, I got an email from an editor who was writing a piece. And he had sent it to a bunch of writers, and he said, I want to write a thankfulness piece, but I think we all need a break from negativity. So can you write about one thing that you're thankful for, no politics? And I thought about this for a while, and I really couldn't think of any aspect of my life that didn't, in some way, seem political. I was like, I'm the child of immigrants, right? Like, I'm a woman of color. I am a mother. I am a woman. I have a sister who has a physical disability. I have, all of the things in my life, I feel.